And some of the reasons it must participate is the public and consumers. And the public and consumers are really pushing for business to do something different. On a recent survey, it said that 91% of American consumers want that companies with businesses they want in their communities, where they work, where people want to work because they want to work in organizations that have these social initiatives, and which stocks and funds they want to invest in. The other thing is people are investing a lot of money in socially responsible investments, and one of $6 is under management or professional management is invested in these socially active businesses. Now I want to talk about three movements in relationship to Jim's concept of real intended change. Three movements that you see in the literature that both academics are writing about and business leaders are implementing in their organizations. First one is new organizational forms. There are three new organizational forms that includes collaborative communities and sustainable leadership models. And the third one is renewed concepts of capitalism, which is being referred to as conscious capitalism. Because the first movement in more detail than the other two. I think some real change has occurred in the way businesses conduct social activism. It used to be that we would see companies advertise and say, well, we contribute a certain amount to this cause or that cause, and the public started to become suspicious of that. How much of that is going to the cause, you say? How environmentally conscious are you? What are you doing about these things? People started thinking of this as greenwashing because they've still said, well, the profit motive, and people may be doing these things, but to what extent? So the other problem that came about is that organizations that were very sincere about making social change, not organizations, but business specifically about making social change, started to run into problems. The conflict was, what if our stakeholders want more, and what if our stockholders or investors want us to have more investment and go for the highest profit as usual? How do we reconcile that with our social mission? And so some employers started to say, we want to protect our social mission. And very recently, there have been new laws passed that have brought about new kinds of for-profit mixed with social organizations called hybrid organizations. One is called the Benefit Corporation. How many have heard of Benefit Corporation? All right, they're quite new. They came about in 2010. 26 states have passed laws, plus the DC, to allow benefit corporations. What's different about this is in their articles of incorporation, they must talk about what social benefit they want to create that will have a material positive impact on society. Now this is business. These are for-profit businesses. And they must consider the effect of these decisions on the stakeholders, not just the stockholders. And third, they must have third-party review by these of these companies by an outside reviewer. This this is a very different concept for business. This is institutional change. The New Deal or the level of social movements in the South or whatever, but it is considerable social change where a for-profit business decides that it is going to have in its articles of incorporation the fact that they must have a material positive effect. Okay, let me just give you an example. There's also something called a B corporation, which is very similar, but it's voluntary. It is not a legal action. And let me just tell you what kind of things they do. There are some companies that both are legally benefit corporations and they follow the certification program called B corporations. One is in New York called Greystone, but their motto is, we don't hire people to bake brownies, we bake brownies to hire people. So that's the kind of difference in style that we're talking about. Another corporation is in Richmond called Impact Makers, and they are a small management IT consulting firm, and they pay their people high wages, competitive wages, but they give their profits, $312,000 last year, to their charity partners. And these are things that are in their articles of incorporation. So look, I'm going to skip to how this ties into real intended change. There's going to be a lot more time for discussion. But what I want to say about this is that Jim, though he suspected corporations of not wanting to engage in this kind of social change, I think, in fact, there are a small number, this is still small scale, a small number of corporations that are trying to move toward real intended change. So if I ask the question, can new business movements meet Burns's challenge of real intended change? My answer is yes and no. Yes, these movements are intentional. These leaders intend the kind of change they're bringing about, and they even put it in, they've even moved it into legislation. But their contributions are important in terms of change in institutions, I think, in terms of changes in behavior, but they're real constraints. They're small scale. So on a big real intended change scale, like a social movement, no, it doesn't meet that yet. But I think it has a lot of potential. These kinds of movements have a lot of potential to do so. And also, they need more time. They need more time, more experience. They need, the way forward is kind of uncertain because these programs are very new. But I think the deal here is that these organizations cannot do this by themselves. I don't think any organization and profit together in collaborative communities to make these real intended changes. But the point is, I think business is a player in this. And that's where Jim and I had some disagreement. But I think he would be pleased to see some of the changes that are occurring.
Thank you.
I can answer more in the question and answer.
Now Dr. Chula will present, and then we'll open it up for discussions on both presentations.
So 10:19? Yeah.
I got you.
Okay, I got you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and Jim and I had many. I think all philosophers do is argue, And so he may have avoided argument in his personal life, but when I talked to him, we almost always argued. And of course, that's why, I have to watch out this isn't hemlock, because philosophers can be quite obnoxious. And so I'm going to try not to be too obnoxious. And I'm going to start out by giving you some background on how, over the past 24 years, I've been looking at leadership ethics, and then we'll get to the sex part. Sex in the morning. And it'll be like red meat to you historians, because I'm not a historian. I might use a couple examples to illustrate things so you can jump all over it when we get to the discussion. So when I came in 1991 to the Jepson School, Dick Kudo was there and 2 other colleagues, and I was really kind of starting from scratch because I did huge literature searches and really couldn't find any serious academic literature on leadership and ethics. Yes, there's a lot of literature saying leaders should have integrity, blah, 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 but that's not very informative. How to understand the issues that were particular to leadership ethics was by asking the question, why is it so difficult to be an ethical leader? Or what are the ethical challenges of leadership itself? I went to the classics because the classics actually say more about the ethics of leaders than any of the contemporary literature I could find. I almost instinctively start with Plato, but I also went to Machiavelli and began framing up what would be the topic of leadership ethics. I came out of business ethics when it was just forming in the mid-'80s. We thought a lot about this. I was at Harvard Business School and at the Wharton School working in this area. So what would leadership ethics look like? And Machiavelli was tremendously helpful. Now, lots of people read Machiavelli as this immoralist. I read Machiavelli as a kind of moralist. And I think he hit the nail on the head in terms of what's really distinctive about ethics in leadership. And that was the fact that there's this constant tension between having the need for high-stakes effectiveness, getting the job done. His princes have to get the job done. They've got to protect the people. There's a lot at stake there, on the one hand. Whereas on the other hand, there's the question of, well, how do you go about doing it? And, do you have to be ethical doing it? This is a problem that leaders writ large and writ small face all the time, of how do you get the job done? People depend on you, but at the same time, you sometimes have to make compromises. In philosophy, people like Michael Walzer and others have called this, in political philosophy, the dirty hands problem. And the dirty hands problem is you often have to deal with people you don't like. And Machiavelli says leaders have to learn how not to be good in order to do their job sometimes. Well, it's kind of a grim picture. It's not a carte blanche to be unethical. It really sets up the problem any leader faces. As historians, in the kinds of conversations I had with Jim, what was interesting is, of course, historians look at what leaders actually do. And, of course, that's important, but then it's the biographer's job to kind of start digging into what leaders actually are like, or their moral character. Now, here's the curious part. We talk about the public and private morality of leaders. So obviously the public morality, we could look at what leaders do. John Stuart Mill, in the beginning of utilitarianism, gives us a way of sorting this out that's unsatisfactory. He says that utilitarianism is judging the ethics of the action. Is it a good or bad action? He says the ethics of the action depend on the action, or depend on the intentions of the doer. So he splits up the person between the person who does it. This means bad people do bad things, and he wants to. Not a very satisfactory answer when I turn to the social science literature and leadership studies, particularly the work on implicit leadership theories and theories that involved perceptions of leaders that people have. There's a body of literature by Mendiel and his colleagues called The Romance of Leadership. And leaders are different. Their relationship is different. So one of the things I did is, instead of looking at ethics as a sidebar of leadership, I looked at leadership as actually a subset of ethics, because it's a particular kind of moral relationship. And that particularity is extremely important when we turn to sex, which, don't worry, we'll get to sex. So it's particularly important because leaders are, in one of my books I say, leadership is morality and immorality magnified. So everything a leader does that's right or wrong is going to have long-term ramifications in ways in which moral behavior, immoral behavior in our personal lives do not. So there's lots of elements of leadership that make it different. I mean, ethics is ethics. The moral principles are the same for everyone. I don't think leaders should be held to higher ethical standards because that would mean we all should be held to lower ones, which doesn't make sense. Leaders, when they fail at living up to higher ethical standards, wreak havoc. So I would say that their quality of adherence to ethical standards, the amount of adherence to ethical standards has to be higher for leaders because of the ramifications of those actions. I've also been very influenced, though, in this relationship between leaders and followers and other constituencies is, of course, the work of Aristotle. And the work of Aristotle, his discussions of leadership, I think, are extremely important, second only to Plato, who's always been my favorite. But one of the things Aristotle talks about in terms of virtue, he's a virtue ethicist, as is Plato and many of the ancient Greeks and some of the ancient Romans, is this idea that virtue is a habit. And so the actual word that ethikos and ethos come from, if you look at the derivations of them, they actually come from habit. This is one of the reasons why, by the way, philosophers don't distinguish between ethics and morals. They actually sort of, I won't go into that about the translation from Greek to Latin, but Aristotle says ethics is a habit, and he has a very interesting way of discussing this because he says your everyday habits reflect the virtues that you have, but he also goes on to say that you can't look at these virtues in separation from other virtues. He talks about the unity of virtues. So, for example, courage is a virtue, but in order to be courageous, well, first of all, the important thing about a virtue is you can't have the virtue of courage without practicing courage. Of courage in the proper way, as the virtue of prudence, the virtue, because someone who isn't prudent when they exercise virtue is foolhardy, and being foolhardy is not courageous. So there's this notion when we look at a person, when we look at the self, first you've got leaders who are these odd people in terms of their relationship to others. People think of them in different ways. They look for kinds of perfection in leaders that leaders don't have because they're just human beings. They expect them to have a lot of power over things. Probably one of the most unique things about ethics and leadership is the fact that leaders are responsible for things they don't do. That's part of the job, is you take responsibility. So, you know, if a plane crashes on your watch, it's actually your fault even though you weren't flying the plane. Most of us in everyday life are not responsible for what our neighbors do down the street, but heads of organizations are responsible for the things that the people who work for them do, whether they're involved in it or know about it or not. So these are some of the things that were helping me to sort of philosophically begin to frame up how do we begin to think about the ethics of leaders. So enter Jim Burns. And so Burns and I began this discussion because in the beginning of his book on leadership, he talks about values. And the first thing that we've been arguing about values, I find values, most philosophers find values like total mush because they're not specific. Moral language is far richer than values. I mean, I can value a good plate of pasta. I can value honesty. His values, I said, you know, Jim, I'd like to see you be more. Liberty is actually not a moral value per se. I mean, it's a value, but it's not necessarily a moral value. So I thought that they were sort of a hodgepodge. And then he had what were called modal values. Modal values got into more basic ethical things like telling the truth and keeping promises and things like that. How you do business. So we talked about this for a while, and but our favorite topic, though, among all of these things of what virtues people had as leaders and what their character was like, really came down to sex. And so he used Roosevelt, which I think when you look at, and you historians know more about Roosevelt than I do, all of the women that he had relationships with. What always struck me about Roosevelt is he seemed to hide in plain sight because all the women he had relationships with, he seemed to do publicly, which is very interesting from a moral point of view, because one of the things when you look at what's wrong with adultery, like what's wrong, well, we all think, well, adultery is a bad thing, but what's wrong with it? Well, in simpler moral terms, it usually involves not keeping a promise, which is a problem, and secondly, it usually involves lying. So if you take all the other things out of it, that's a bit of a problem. That's why I think Roosevelt was kind of interesting and not the best model to look at. But then there are particular problems with having outside affairs that a lot of presidents had. Betrayal. Well, the notion of betrayal is interesting because you can't betray somebody unless you trust them. So nobody's betrayed if you don't trust somebody from the beginning, because that's kind of expected. Did it matter? Did it matter if what sex was? Sex came into play in the Clinton trials. I found it really interesting in Stephen Ambrose's book, Character Above All, where he says one of the things that Eisenhower's girlfriend Summersby said in her book was that they never actually consummated things because he was unable to do this. Stephen Ambrose writes that Eisenhower wasn't able to have sex with Summersby because he felt guilty, which meant it was a sign of his good character. I don't know about you, but I don't buy it. Maybe he was just tired. The Clinton case, we love talking about the Clinton case. The Clinton case was great. And of course, in Clinton, there was this whole definition of sex and what constituted sex and whether there were, particular parameters that made sense. The other thing people looked at in terms of the morality is obviously you're betraying your spouse. The spousal betrayal that we can empathize with. But the big question that Jim and I had was, did this affect leadership? So yes, Roosevelt did these things, but then he did all these other great things. So maybe we could say the man, maybe there's never say that, but look at all the great stuff he did. So lastly, there was the question of danger. Kennedy, of course, is one of the most dangerous sexual presidents we've had in terms of the kinds of relationships and what he did. And along with danger, it's sort of interesting. There are romances. And then there's the kind of affairs that are just simply physical, sexual affairs. And there's an interesting distinction between them two from a moral point of view, in that romances usually involve respect for persons, in that you look at the person as a whole human being. A lot of times the other ones do not. They're just using people as kinds of objects, and those have a moral difference. Anyway, Al's telling me I have to stop talking. I always obey Al.
Al's power is nil.
Okay, I will finish up. But lastly, I think, the big question today is always about the press. And one of the things that's unfortunate about the way that the press reports these kinds of affairs of political leaders is that they're completely without nuance in terms of what's going on. Whereas I think individuals, you don't have to be a philosopher to intuitively make various kinds of distinctions. And the last example of this that I think really exemplifies the change is a lot of people, when the Clinton affair was going on, and I spent a lot of time in Europe, and we're saying, it's just American prudishness and blah, blah, blah. But the case of Dominique Strauss-Kahn, as it played out in France recently, has been absolutely fascinating, because they say, oh, well, the French, it's okay. We don't mind if people have affairs. It's perfectly all right. And then they started looking at the details of this, and then you start to see the moral distinction come out in most people's minds. And the moral distinction is, here was a man who, in the trial, referred to women as the equipment. He was a man who basically did some rather violent things to people, whether they were willing to or not. I mean, what I always thought was interesting about Clinton is he tried all the time, got turned down a lot. And that was fine. With Strauss-Kahn, it was a lot different, and even the French started to realize that as a person, I mean, given the way people regard leaders, if you start to see that they have so little respect for persons, I mean, there's a lot of misogyny you see going through this, you begin to wonder whether that's actually someone who ought to be in a leadership position, even if what they're not doing is a problem for national security or anything else. We as human beings do want to think of leaders as people who respect other persons. So the last question is this. if a president has an affair and nobody's there to see it, doesn't matter. It's your old tree falling in the wood. And I would say it may not matter at the time, but we could discover it matters. Job is. So, you know, I think all of these distinctions make some sense. The role of ethics, you know, philosophic ethics is not to make judgments on who's bad or good, but actually to try to understand how we make these judgments and whether they actually matter in terms of leadership. So I'm sorry, Al, if I ran over.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Before we open it up, I just want to ask Gil and Joanne whether you want to make any comments on each other's.
Just one thing is that when I was asked by Jim's publisher to look over his book, Transforming Leadership, before they published it. And my one comment was he had cases on everything but business. And so then this story, which he had told me before, about an uncle who committed suicide after the stock market crashed, and he just didn't want to deal with business after that. So
I know
there's
that
your
well.
answer. Yeah.
Oh, no, I know that well about him.
Questions? Yes, ma'am.
I asked this question as a leadership student right now, and also as a naval officer. And there's actually two questions. My first question is, you said the comment, values or total mush. And I empathize with that because I think ethics turn out to be total mush because it depends. And you had made a pretty solid statement about, well, ethics are ethics. And I mean, I'm going to defer to you, but it seems like the further you dig, deep, that it just gets, it depends. You know, every country has a different kind of view of what a certain ethical dilemma will be. My second question is, how can you lead?
Well, let me take two. By saying values is a mush, what I'm saying is it's imprecise, that morality involves a specific language of obligation, care. There's a whole vocabulary that gives you different facets of it. It becomes mush for some people, because some people like to say ethics is black and white, and that's really good, but that's where you make a lot of bad decisions. But it doesn't become mush. It's just that you need to take the time to deal with all of the ambiguities and ultimately make a decision. And unfortunately, in public discourse on ethics, it's all in very, very bright lines, and that's a problem. The second part, I'm glad you brought up in terms of your subordinates in ethics, is what you see in the Kennedy case, and in a different way in the Clinton case, is in the Kennedy case, subordinates are enabling him, he's embarrassing them. He made Dean Rusk get a villa so he could have an affair before he went to see the Pope. I mean, if you're Secretary of State, that's got to be demoralizing. Clinton's case, and I knew a lot of people who worked in the White House with Clinton, the one thing you heard from people was how disappointed they were because they thought they were doing the good. And this sordid thing undercuts it. So it makes a huge impact on subordinates, what they do. So in that regard, it matters on the inside, even if it's not mattering on the outside, on what the world sees on the outside.
Actually, before I ask the question, we've heard a lot about Jepson, we've heard about Williams. How many Regent people do we have in here? Raise your hands. You've either just gotten a degree or you work there. Okay, we have a good representation of Regent.
Yeah, good.
I just wanted to make that clear.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Joanne, this question is primarily for you. When you look at that, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If a leader doesn't necessarily put a lot of focus on him or herself being treated right, how does that?
Well, I think he would be a great endorser of it. I think his blind spot always was that I think he fell in love a little bit with a lot of the people he studied. And, so we talk about Kennedy's affairs. And it's okay. I mean, it depends on what you're focusing on because it's not something you want to do. But I think you would agree because if you look at his theory of transforming leadership, it is about a kind of mutual respect, because notice that they transform each other, and that's, I think, he would certainly endorse the golden rule.
Joanne, there were a couple statements, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, but there were a couple of paradoxes, I thought. Mm-hmm. The first one I wanted to comment on is the idea of freedom, and our country is based on the idea of freedom. But I can't help but recognize the paradox of we're fighting for freedom and we're holding slaves. You know, that's one of the great paradoxes for me. So I understand why freedom is not necessarily a strong ethic or a strong value, because it all depends on who's holding it, and it all depends on whose freedom we're talking about.
That's right.
And the second one was toward the end. You said that you posed the question is, if a leader has an affair and no one knows about it, does it matter? But who's he having the affair with?
Right. Right.
So if
Yeah.
and therefore it will always matter. And the one person and if there's a person involved, you can bet there's two people. Let me see, 1, 2. There will always be a third person involved, because the second person is going to tell somebody.
Well, I mean, I think there could be some leaders who actually have affairs with themselves, but that's a whole other story.
That's true.
I was hoping you weren't going to go there, but
So I'm going to be a bit of a buzzkill. First question, how many people are here from Eastern University?
Hey.
And then my second question is, how many people are either... Applause. It's okay to applaud for business owners and operators. I was really interested in your presentation, and what I sensed was an underlying assumption that the profit motive is not compatible with being pro-social. And so I just have a couple little things to add on to hopefully open up some discussion about this, because I have sensed that through my whole academic career, during my doctoral studies, particularly. Not so much during my corporate MBA, rah-rah, we all liked it. However, we were less likely to explore the dark side of the profit motive there. So the assumption that the profit motive is inherently antisocial, so I'll even make it a stronger statement. That's what I think we maybe are carrying around with us. So if we could unpack the word pro-social a little bit, and what does that mean? And from our worldview, when we run a profitable business and we are providing jobs and growing jobs, that feels inherently pro-social to us. And how about the company so from an employee's perspective, if there's profits to be shared and they're being $310,000 being shared out there, but I earned that, helped earn that, might I feel that it a bit more pro-social for you to share that with me, to then share and spend in my community in the way that I see fit? Some questions hopefully open up.
Yeah. Going to be exactly for social change, because the profit motive has the higher. What I'm trying to say through some of these new business models is people in business know that's an underlying issue, and a lot of people in business don't feel that way. They really want to do both things, and they've not always had. Let me give you 2 examples. Ben and Jerry's was a pro-social company in that they wanted to give either money or volunteer time. But when they got ready to sell the business, they wanted to sell the business to a company that offered them slightly less but believed in their social values. And they were stopped from doing that because the stockholders, they were concerned that the stockholders would take them to court for that. It didn't happen, but Ben and Jerry's decided to go ahead and sell to Unilever, which was the company that offered more money, so that they wouldn't be taken to court because of the stockholders. So they could legitimately weigh those two factors. But here's the thing. One, it's a benefit corporation. And two, the people who sign up, the stockholders, know that those values are going to be weighed in that way, and they are in it because they approve of that. That's one thing. The everyday business that is giving back to society through creating jobs, doing the right thing by their employers, is another very important feature and a good feature. This whole conscious capitalism movement is really about that, the head of the conscious capitalism movement says that he doesn't feel, it's Mackey of Whole Foods, that you have to have a specific social program to be doing social good for the society. He feels his business in and of itself, and I was trying to find how he defines his business, but it's basically giving good quality food to customers. And wages and all of that, that is a part of being pro-social, being a good company. And so, yes, if you have a business that is not a benefit corporation, but it is a benefit to society, yeah, that's a good. He was fighting against care of the other stakeholders, their employees and people like that. I'm sorry, say that.
Is that also a question of the role of unions in business, that it's not just up to the employer to take care or not take good care of the workers? Unfortunately, so the workers aren't entitled, as they are legally, to unionize and to fight for their own rights and their own salaries.
That's true.
There's a question over here, gentlemen, and then I'll get back to you. Yes, go ahead.
I'm kind of fascinated by these new public benefit corporations. We talked a bit about ethics and ambiguity. When we talk about public benefit companies, how are these structures dealing with that same paradox, that same difficulty when it comes to what is a public benefit? We talked about capitalism in itself may be a public benefit. But when we look at activism versus public benefit, how are they working through that definition? How are they struggling with that?
They actually define it. There are two ways that they can look at it, but they actually define it in their articles of incorporation. And they say there are specific they either have to say that they're going to work with specific nonprofits, or the company as a whole is going to do something to make a difference, like the Brownie Company, that they work in low socioeconomic areas, and they were designed to employ those people who were not usually employable. So they define it up front. It doesn't mean they don't have conflict. I mean, they still, whenever they have decisions to make, they still have to weigh all those issues, and they have to weigh them with their investors. But the investors know going into it that this is part of what they're buying into. And one of the things I wanted to say too about the wages is they make sure that they are competitive in their wages, in their industry, in the benefit corporation. In the L3Cs, the low profit companies, they have a mission to look at the social good as a higher issue than profits. And they're having more difficulty getting investors because of that. But in the benefit corporation, they're doing well. I have data to say that they are performing equally as well as their counterparts who are not benefit organizations.
Yes.
Gil, the term pro-social, is that the same thing as the term as sustainable companies? Is that comparable to sustainable, or did pro-social grow out of the sustainable corporations? That was the term that was used around, if I say the turn of the century, meaning the end of the 20th century coming into the 21st. There was a big push for sustainable corporations or sustainable companies, and now I hear pro-social. So I'm asking.
Yeah, that's a new sustainable organizations. It both make a profit, but they also are involved in either environmental issues, education, low-income employment, things like that. They're usually about hybrid organizations that declare in one way or the other, either voluntarily through their legal incorporation, that they are going to do both, that they're going to make a profit and be engaged in some type of social good, usually in alliance with a nonprofit organization.
It could, foundation says that they have to do it.
Yes, or they can do it, the B corporations actually do it voluntarily. It's not, they set themselves up where they voluntarily do it that way, and they have a third party. Each of these has a third party reviewer to say you are actually doing what you said you're doing.
Dr. Cronin? Or Tom?
Thank you. If last night was a triumph for Williams College, today's a triumph for the Jepson School. So great job, excellent presentations. In the spirit of Jim Burns, however, I want to written by Ayn Rand, novels in America. She's the godmother of the libertarian movement, the Tea Party movement, and if she were here, I don't share most of her views, but if she was here, she would say, get this stuff out of the business. I want a good shoe, or I want a good computer. Let those people go to the church they want to, or give to the charity, or volunteer, but don't, it's like central planning. Get the government out of our life, and out of our bedrooms, and out of our gun rack, and out of our corporations. And what you're doing is having creeping kind of morality or consciousness, which should be privatized, and it should be the free market. And so let me, I'm an unlikely representative for Ayn Rand, but in the spirit of Jim Burns, who always liked these kind of things in the spirit of freedom and liberty and American individualism, and why not decentralize that to the family or the individual? So that's my question to Gil. I'll save one for Joanne.
Hear that argument all the time, and there are a couple of things. First of all, nobody's required to become a benefit corporation or B corporation or whatever. This is a decision by the people who form this kind of business. Nobody is required to. These are people who want to do this. this is their desire to give back to, a lot of people have left places like IBM and other places to work at these organizations. There are many companies out there who are not doing it. The free enterprise market is alive and well, but on the other side of freedom, there are these organizations who want to do this. That's one thing. The second thing is there's a big push from the public to do this and from consumers to do this. And they actually choose, like I used some of that data, people actually choose places to work because the companies have these dual missions, and they also choose choice. I mean, the free market is still out there, but people want this. The customers want to give back in that way. So, I mean, yep, that's a good argument, and nobody's stopping that group. But also, there's the right to want to give back in this particular way, and it seems to be working. Nobody's losing money. They're still gaining plenty of profits.
Well, so my question is when we see these forces come, something purely altruistic.
Yeah.
I'm not questioning it. But underlying this is not really driving the profits. I mean, if you shop at Whole Foods, you know they're making profit.
Oh, yeah, and Whole Foods. And the way leadership behaviors that they have, they're doing good. That's what they call conscious capitalism, which is a very different model. And people who have a lot of money, who have more money, and that's them from having this dual kind of organization, because there have been restrictions.
Incidentally, Mackie is a disciple of Ayn Rand's.
Let me, you go, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Just an input for those of you that are interested in this subject that we might call values-driven business leadership. And there's a new Center for Research and Study at Benedictine University in Lisle, Illinois, and it's called the Center for Values-Driven Leadership. And they are in the midst of not only driven leadership, but also researching the subject in conjunction with a group called Small Giants. So researching and building a body of knowledge around corporations that do of being values driven and profitable.
Yes.
Newman gave 100% of his profits away, but there are difficulties with Mackey, even though he says he's socially responsible. Howard Metzenbaum, Senator Howard Metzenbaum, who's now deceased, took him to task for being a monopoly and eating up all of the small health food stores, and there's also a lot of other problems with Whole Foods. So I'm wondering how those things are reconciled.
There are two different models. The Benefits Corporation and the B corporations actually incorporate giving social benefits, either donating or giving their time to nonprofits. Mackey actually says, I don't think you have to have those social responsibility programs as an add-on. That's his conscious capitalism is more about, he says the business that he does itself is a social good to society. It's a very different philosophy. And they a responsibility program that I'm trying to find his quote about how he describes his organization, because I think, oh, here it is. So he says that the organization should have a higher purpose in and of itself, and this is theirs: helping people to eat well, improve the quality of their lives, and increase their lifespan. And that's theirs. And they don't have the kind of program. It says he is a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist, but he thinks it can be done in an enlightened way. I'm not saying this is my philosophy. I'm just saying this is his philosophy and the social, the conscious capitalism philosophy.
So in defense of Ayn Rand, I wanted to come back to your comment. I kind of see our organizations, and from the little bit I've done on my master's program, as kind of coming through a Maslow's hierarchy of needs over the last, 200 years of, we've kind of come up to a point, and we've studied a lot of region as far as we want a spiritualness in our organizations now. We've come up to a more enlightened way of thinking in our organizations now. And I think if Ayn Rand were alive, she would be in that same mind frame in today's organizations. She was just, I think, against overly regulated capitalism. But I like the social, that the social is influencing it, but not demanding and regulating it. Can both of you comment on just like how we've changed maybe over the last 100 years as far as as leaders, we just wanted to meet the needs, and now we're moving beyond that into a more enlightened organization.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one of the interesting things about these questions is if you look at the history of business ethics over the years, the language of it has changed. And so in the 1970s, in the late 70s, there used to be what's called social auditing. And years people said, can't you get ethics out of the term? So the word for business ethics became just social responsibility, and then it evolved into, in Europe they talk about when I go to Europe I teach sustainability classes, which are business ethics classes, because people want to get rid of ethics. Then they add, but it's kind of all code. And that's what's so interesting when you look at it. And then they come back and forth. So then back in the early 2000s, they were doing social audits in Europe as if they had reinvented them. And I think one of the problems, particularly in management, any kind of notion of management history, is it's ahistorical. So people like reinvent, they discover that people work in teams well together. They've been discovering that for 150 and they discovered that a long time ago too, but they don't remember it because there's a sort of ahistoricism to business that's remarkable, and people don't like to use the word ethics because it gives a lot of people the heebie-jeebies. And it's been that way ever since, for 40 years I've been doing ethics, that's the way it works. So that's why you get to something like this, which is, a B corporation is quite specific, but all the language around it is incredibly confusing in terms of what it means.
Gil, do you want to comment on spirituality here? Or?
Well,
yeah,
I didn't talk much about spirituality in these particular corporations, but what I wanted to say is one example I use in the paper gives an example of it back in the 1800s of somebody that does all these things that Mackey says he does. But in all these good things, you can give us more money. And so it just fell flat after he had done it for a long period of time. But this is not, certainly not.